Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Howdy.
Okay, I think we can start. I have the first few items in the agenda. So the first one is about the agent management. So the agent management work group was started with to come up with a remote management solution for OpenTelemetry Collector, possibly other standalone agents. Among the capabilities that we are considering is the ability to remotely configure the agents, to push the configuration from some central management server to the agents. And immediately, I guess, after we started this work, we got a request to consider extending this to OpenTelemetry SDKs, to essentially push the configuration of the SDKs in a similar way from some central location to the SDKs. So maybe you send the, I don't know, sampling rate to the SDK, right? Now, this is technically doable provided that there is a configuration file format defined for the SDKs, which is an open issue. So hopefully that will be a thing, hopefully soon. So as soon as it is there, then technically we can use the same agent management protocol and the same approach to do the configuration of the SDKs. So this is essentially a request for comments. I'd like to know whether people think this is a good idea, whether you think it's valuable or no. There is an open issue. I linked it from the agenda. Comments are welcome. Let me know what you think now, or maybe comment later on that issue. Okay, so yeah, anyway, the link is there. Feel free to go there, read the suggestion and comment there. The second item I have there is about the instrumentation library, or renaming of it to the instrumentation scope, which was discussed, I think, 2 weeks ago in this SpecSig meeting. The idea was to revive the original meaning or the intent behind the instrumentation library, which was proposed initially as the component, as a concept. So I was exploring whether it's even possible technically, right? Whether that would be a breaking change if we tried to do that. It seems like it is a breaking change. At least the JavaScript investigation shows that we can't do that in a way that is not a breaking change in the API that is already exposed to the users of JavaScript SDK, and which is already declared to be stable. That's my understanding of the current state of JavaScript.
Yeah, that's correct. I actually think that that's probably going to be true of all of the SIGs, because in the specification, we have this readable span interface that has the instrumentation library available. So any SIG that has already declared 1.0, I suspect would have that problem, because that changes the span processor interface. I also wanted to quickly mention, at least in my understanding, instrumentation library and component are not the same thing. Component is the component that's being instrumented, like MySQL, and the instrumentation library is the library that's doing the instrumenting. So like auto instrumentation MySQL or something like that. In some cases, those could be the same, where a library has instrumented itself for like native instrumentation and stuff like that. But they're two different concepts, and I believe they should be represented by two different fields if we want to have them both.
I don't disagree. I think we don't even have the component as a concept anywhere in the spec today. It's not mentioned anywhere. Right?
No, we don't, but we did have them both for some period of time. For about 6 months, they both were in the spec.
Okay, so I guess anyway, going back to the idea of exploring the renaming, right? It seems like renaming is not really possible to do. It's too late. It's now part of the our guarantees, which then I don't know. To me, the consequence of that is actually that we cannot extend the meaning, in my opinion, of the instrumentation library, of the concept of it. It would be too much of a stretch to me we try to somehow, even if we ignored what you said, Daniel, and try to say that, oh no, you know what, the component is actually what we intended to record in the instrumentation library name. I think that would be too much of a stretch, given the name. It's very precise. The instrumentation library is a specific name. It has a specific meaning. It has a definition now. And trying to say that the intent was different, we're going to record something else in that field instead, I think that would be wrong. That's my opinion. I think we should keep the meaning as it is, which again, that has a consequence, right? Means that the whole notion of let's bring that back, let's bring back the original meaning, then maybe rename it and then use it for the logger name. I think it kind of becomes a big stretch to me, to be honest. Seems like it's not doable. I don't know what do other people think.
So if we want it just for the logger name, then having the logger name as a top level component might make sense. If we want it for the other signals as well, it may make sense to introduce some new field like instrumentation target or something like that, or maybe even bring component back and have them both live side by side, because they do have separate meanings. Yeah. And then in some cases for native instrumentation, they would either have the same value or you would omit one of them, or whatever makes sense.
Yeah, possibly. I think yes, what you're saying does make sense. If the idea is that for obtaining a tracer or a meter, we do want to be able to specify something other than the instrumentation library name, then probably that's an additional new API to obtain a tracer in a different way, which accepts a different concept, right? Instead of the instrumentation library. I don't know if we want to do that, but to me, that would be a more natural thing, a more natural way to evolve the API, rather than trying to kind of to widen the understanding of what instrumentation library really means without actually reflecting that in the name of the concept. Okay, so I guess what I'm going to do is probably close the issue which asks for renaming, and then I will probably open another issue which tries to discuss what we were just trying to discuss, whether there is a need to have an alternate concept additional or no, and where do we want to go from that. But I think kind of the renaming at this point seems to be a dead end to me. Okay, if we're good with that, then I guess I can move to the next one. Cool. So the next one is, I guess, maybe a smaller one, or has smaller consequences. It's an addition of another timestamp field to the log data model. This was discussed in the logging SIG, and we found the need to record the observed timestamp as opposed to the generated timestamp, the time when the event was generated in the log records. The detailed description is there. I linked it in the agenda. Please have a look at the proposal and see what you think about it. The logging SIG has discussed it and is in favor of adding it. We have approvals, but I'd like to maybe have a broader discussion and more feedback from others as well before we move forward with that. Okay, that's it from me.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tigran. Yeah, by the way, in the latest PR, the observed timestamp, I see that, as you mentioned, that there are enough reviews from the log SIG. So do you want reviews because you want to merge this, or do you think that like members from other signals should review this anyway?
I'd like to have more broader acceptance of the concept before I move forward and merge it.
Okay. Makes sense. Thank you for that. Okay, moving forward then, Martin, request for comments on this draft PR 2192. Martin, are you around? You are muted. Well, I think Martin, oh yes.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so we had discussion about this at the last couple meetings, and I opened a PR as a result. And I actually need some guidance here because I'm realizing that there are two things that I don't know how to handle exactly in the PR. Does anybody need like refresher on this? What this is about? Essentially, I'm trying to introduce a new field, telemetry source name, that would define the name of the source of the telemetry independent of the type. So we in the client side SIG, what we want to do is send this all started by the need to identify the type of telemetry. In our case, the client-side telemetry. So in a different PR, I proposed adding a new set of attributes prefixed with app. So instead of service.name, you would have app.name and corresponding attributes. And there was, I think what we realized that service name right now is required, and it's used to identify, it's intended, aside from describing a service, like a backend service, it's intended to describe just a generic source of telemetry. So the purpose of this PR was to introduce an independent set of fields or field. And so our one thing that I have a question about is the backwards compatibility with service.name. It appears that since it's required, this would be a breaking change. And I guess what I would like to know is, should the service name be always required or only for backend applications as a backwards compatibility? So that's one question.
So I personally am not sure where this requirement is coming from. Why did we end up having the service name as a required thing for everything? I think it's a stretch. There are things that should emit telemetry, which are not services. maybe it's very common, but I don't think everything is a service and everything has to have this attribute there. The collector definitely emits telemetry, which is not about services. So it doesn't include service name in everything. Maybe it should be in everything that SDKs emit, so possibly. But then if that's true, like if we have client-side applications, then we should call them services as well, right? For this requirement to make sense. So I guess the question is there, right? Are we actually happy to say that the service is something that also includes client-side applications? Possibly. I don't think that's entirely wrong. Then that would make that requirement maybe acceptable to me. If the client-side applications are different, then that requirement automatically becomes something that should be removed there.
So for some context, Tigran here, the decision that we made previously was that client-side applications should use service name, and service name is a requirement for all resources in OpenTelemetry. That's like in the spec. I think the collector can get around it because it's probably worded in a way that it's just for SDKs. But the decision, the client-side instrumentation team, I think, was not as active when we made that original decision around service name. And there's a big negative to calling it service name in that we're going to constantly have people come in and say, why the hell is this a service? I don't get it, right? So the thing that we're looking at trying to figure out how to do now is, can we change what we have today in a non-breaking way, such that the client-side instrumentation can use something called application, and back-end, instrumentation can use something called service, and everybody's happy. So the problem, though, is that we specified service name is required, right? That's how it's specified. But the idea of trying to stick with service name and forcing client-side to use that, I think there's agreement. At least there's a big negative in the client-side instrumentation around this, causing massive confusion in OTel. So we'd like to try to avoid that if possible in any proposal we have. So just to put some clarity on the discussion here, that's kind of the discussion we're having, is like, how do we, it's similar to your instrumentation library effort of, we don't want to rename the thing. We kind of want to add a new thing that works with the old thing, right? So what does that look like, and how do we change the spec?
Also,
is
like
the confusion, sorry, Aaron, is the confusion because we call the client-side applications a service? Is that the confusion? How?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd also like to point out one of the reasons why it's probably required is most telemetry backends have a requirement of some sort of name for them to accept those kind of traces. So that's probably where the requirement ended up originating from.
I'm not quite sure about that, because the collector definitely emits telemetry, which does not include service name today, and it's been like that for a very long time now. Does that mean that all of that the collector emits is unreceivable by those backends? Is that really so?
There are a number of
spans that are emitted to Jaeger. Yes, they're unreceivable. I believe Zipkin has the same requirement.
Okay.
I mean, what we could do is propose some kind of way of having backend specific translations from this or some default, and lessen the requirement. But I don't know how that will relate to the change of the API across the wire. But one of the saving graces of where we are with protobuf right now, our protobuf definition is all fields are optional. Like protobuf 3, there is no required field.
Well, this would be in a resource attribute anyway, so it's a key value. It's not even a named field in the resource. I think we can certainly choose something different, and we could probably say one of service name or application name is required. I don't know what the impact to consumers will be if we do that, though.
That is the proposal on the table. So the proposal is to make a new thing that is absolutely required, like a new name thing. And so Martin has a, the proposal actually has a namespace and a name pair, but it could just be a single thing. But there's a new thing that represents both an application and a service. And then you would also have a duplicated service.name and application.name. So the problem is this backwards compatible or not with our previous spec, right? Because yes, in the future, there will be a guaranteed name you can use for all Jaeger Zipkin exporters, right? But do SDKs need to kind of backfill service.name from application.name for correct behavior to keep backwards compatibility? That's like the open question here, is like, how do we handle that scenario? But in terms of what the proposal is, it's to have a new name that's unique, and then have service.name and application, sorry, service.star and application.star exposed and open for whatever services need and whatever front end applications need, right? That's the proposal on the table. It's just the detail here is how do we take a service.name requirement and make a backwards compatible spec change so that folks don't break during transition?
How settled is the client sig on having that additional app.name field as well?
So if we have this other name field that would be generic, then I don't think we would need app.name. If that's what you're asking.
Yeah, that is what I'm asking, because, you know, it seems like one thing to have service.name floating around as a historical artifact, but then to introduce other fields that kind of duplicate the information that's in telemetry source name doesn't seem that great. So
there is other like related topic to my other bullet point, which is we need a way to identify the type of telemetry. And originally we thought that the presence of the app attributes would indicate that it's a client-side telemetry. But the problem now is, like, if we make if you use a different name and the only attribute that is required is the name, then potentially could happen that there are no app attributes at all. So so I guess my additional question or proposal would be to introduce another field that's like an enum of type.
So if you read the semantic conventions around resources right now, for a particular resource, there are required attributes. There's only one required attribute for all resources, which is service.name.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're running in Kubernetes with the semantic conventions, we actually say, like, if you're going to provide a resource around like a Kubernetes pod, here are the things you need to provide. And I think it'd be totally acceptable for you to say, if you're providing telemetry from client side, here are the things you have to provide. I don't think we need a type there, because you should be able to leverage that same like app.name in the sense of basically, one thing to think about here is resource attributes are actually expensive because we send them with telemetry. At least we should think about not sending a maximal set. We should think about sending a minimal set that's identifying in our spec. And then users can expand as they need, because we need to make room for them. And if we have this giant bundle of tons and tons of crap, then unless users really want all of that, it makes it hard for them, especially if we specify these as musts. Anyway, back to the original thing. I think you should be able to specify a app.thing for, like, if this comes from a browser, or app. Whatever if this comes from a mobile phone, right? And et cetera for other devices. And you should be able to rely on that, because the way those resource semantic conventions are defined are, if you're running on this, here's the semantic conventions that we provide for consistent resource identity across the system. We still have a bit to dive into of whether or not these are additive, right? So if I'm a cakes pod and I'm also some other thing, do I get all of these blurred together, or do I just get a few of them? That is completely lacking in the spec right now. But from conceptually, I don't think you need a type. I think all you need to do is specify this client resource has these guaranteed attributes, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Although I looking at even like the existing spec, like if you look at service, like the only attribute that's required is service.name.
We're very conservative around required because you can never change it.
So that
As
means,
we're discussing now, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, there's a difference between required and convention, right? Like I honestly think that if you mark this as optional, but every single piece of telemetry our group provides has it by default, and the tools don't work if it's not there, it's effectively required and everyone will treat it that way. But it also gives us room to kind of fix things in the spec later if we decide we want to migrate in non-breaking ways, right? So that's one reason that we use optional.
Okay. That makes sense. But you don't think that would be, there's a possibility of environment where you just can't get those attributes like version or bundle name? Then what?
That's definitely a possibility. Yeah. So the identifying thing where you want to know it's from client side, I guess if we step into that use case, what's the specific use case there that you're trying, where you would need to identify this came from a client versus this came from a server?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And in that use case, what are your identifying attributes you can use to distinguish between the two?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it would be a presence of some of either like service dot something or app dot something.
Yeah.
Does the client SIG have specific, reasons why they think that like a client telemetry source, its instrumentation needs to be differentiated from a services, or is that just kind of looking into the future and projecting? Like, are those use cases there where you need to differentiate between the two?
Yeah, I mean, I think the processing pipeline for those two types of telemetry is going to be very different. We think, or like the shape of the data is going to be very different too. Like, so like, for example, like we think that like a lot of the signals coming from client side are going to be events. And like, we're going to have to like distinguish between logs and events for client side. So like on the back end, the processing of that type of telemetry is going to have to know like where to send it.
Okay, so what I would say to make progress here is I don't think we're going to make a decision because we're introducing people to the topic. Everyone, please read the PR. For Martin, it might make sense for you to list some requirements around that. Like the bit around logs as events is pretty interesting. If we could write, and I'm going to use business speak, like a requirements doc of like, here are the requirements that we have for what we need from a client side, right? And then that can help people evaluate. Because I do think this generic ID can work out. We can do it in a backwards compatible way. But if you also need a way to identify, absolutely, this was client side, so I interpret my logs differently, that means there's another component besides your current PR that will be needed, right? So I just want to make sure that we handle the whole use case. And so documenting what that is would be ideal.
Okay, yeah. In that PR that I opened for the source name, I did list the requirements that I think are in play here.
Great. So then sounds like people need to read it, and we need to give them time to think through it. I don't think like effectively, I think more discussion today won't be more productive than it's already been. So maybe we come back and reevaluate in a discussion in a week, and we'll see what comments we get on the thing. I'll take some time myself to help maybe craft a proposal around the backwards compatibility issue and send it to you for you to think over. That's one thing I'll do, but we should probably come back in a week if we haven't resolved it on the bug, and everyone should comment with their thoughts on the bug as they've had time to digest.
Okay, sounds good to me.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. We have, by the way, time box of 20 minutes by the end of the call to discuss metrics. So let's move fast. There's only one more point. Johannes, are you around?
Yes, I'm around. Will take much less than 10 minutes.
Just wanted to give a quick update about the messaging semantic conventions work on messaging work group. Last week we put up an early draft OTAP, just to capture the agreements that we made so far, which are around context propagation. So that OTAP, it's not really for like real review yet. It's not ready for real review. It's just for people who wanna see what what's the state of the current work and where we're at. You can look into this OTAP and we will update that as we go. Currently, we have some first bits there regarding context propagation. We have an agreement there, and we are now discussing span structure attributes. And then the last part left will be the individual like systems where we want to give conventions for. So we will update this OTAP as we go. And whoever is interested in like offline collaboration or wants to see where we're at, this OTAP is the point to look for. That's it.
Very good. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I already see some comments there. So yeah, it's good that this discussion is going already. Thank you. Okay. If there's nothing else to comment, we can jump into metrics. Josh.
All right. We've had a no screen sharing day so far, so I'm going to continue the tradition. We're trying to get the metrics SDK marked stable. So I have a link here in the docs to the project that you can see all the different things, but I did a quick roll-up summary here. So we have two to-dos that are in progress with no one actively working on, kind of. One is the clarify sum aggregation bug that just came in. I took a quick crack at answering it, but basically the question here is around what the value is to sum aggregation on async instruments. I'm going to take a step back. Okay, in our API calls, we have record this value as one thing that you can call. So like if for histograms, it's hey, go record this value in a metric. For async callbacks, it's hey, here's the current value of the whole sum. And I'm going to call those like total or cumulative values, right? Then we also have a counter instrument, which is, hey, add this to the value that you've stored. Okay, that is a delta recording or a partial recording. Okay, and so sum aggregation for partial recordings like sums all those things together and gives you sum at the end. That's what it's designed to do. And the bug is asking, does it make sense to sum async instruments where they give you an entire value? And the answer here is incredibly nuanced to some extent. So partly the answer is no, you shouldn't sum together two absolute values. But the other answer is yes, you should, because if I define a view where I get rid of a label, what sum tells me to do is if I have two measurements across two labels and I'm getting rid of the label, I sum those two things together, right? And so that's what sum aggregation means for async instruments. The question to the group is, I just gave that description. Should we put that in the spec? Does that need to be in the spec or is it implicit? I'm kind of asking other implementers of the spec how confusing this is. For clarity, in the Java prototype, not the current implementation, I actually had a difference between a delta measurement and a cumulative measurement. I called them out explicitly to avoid confusing myself over how to use this. And in the end, it turned out I used them pretty much the same way, no matter what. The code didn't change. So I got rid of that distinction.
A quick question,
yeah.
Josh. So
Yeah.
if, let's say you were going down the path where, you actually did want to sum together these async observations, and you didn't have a view that did spatial reaggregation, would it be is there any actual sum taking place, or are you just kind of, because you're observing a cumulative sum already, you're just omitting that? Basically, I'm trying to ask, is this question only relevant if you have views in place or not?
Yeah, so I think there's a nuance with the default behavior. If I report an async sum more than once for the same set of labels, what should happen?
Can you do that? In
It is
one
physically
collection?
possible for it's physically possible for someone to write that code. We had talked about it being an error. Cijo put a related issue here, I think, that maybe, I believe we had talked about this before. That's kind of considered an error with use dropping some attribute.
It looks like the same issue, Josh, you just described. Like in the presence of view, you can drop some attributes, which means even for asynchronous, you still have to do the summing. Feels like they are exactly the same.
Right. So if we have two people opening this issue and one of them being an implementer of metrics, maybe we should clarify this in the spec and make it explicit why this is needed. Is that?
Yep, that makes sense because the term, I think the terms spatial aggregation and temporal aggregation existed like in the old version of the spec that has been since removed. So maybe it's time to bring it back to make sure everyone is really understanding this concept.
Yeah, well, we'll have to actually define those terms because I try to avoid that in my description just because I tend to use too much metric jargon. So anyway, we should actually define those terms and put it in. Anyone have time to take this bug and add that guidance? Riley added supplementary guidelines found the issue posted by Cijo. Okay, if that's the case, we can close this bug. Josh, since you commented that, would you want to take this bug? Do you have time?
The new bug, sure, I will add that.
Cool, thank you. Cool. So that was issue number one. That's a to-do. The second one is around periodic metric reader clarification. We had talked about this before. There's a action item that effectively during the metric sig we discussed the lack of precise description, which was intentional in order to give room for language implementers. And the idea was we would add a concrete example around periodic metric reader. So the confusing thing here was whether or not the collect method is exposed on periodic metric reader for subclasses or external people to call, or if periodic metric reader should not allow anyone but its timer, right, to collect metrics. That's the current issue. And basically we talked about just having we specifically allowed this to be flexible and someone wanted to write a example code here. That's what we discussed. All I want as an owner is anyone willing to sign up to do this, to write that clarification work.
Hey, I'm assigned this one and I can still handle it.
Okay. Oh, great. Thanks, Aaron. I didn't realize it was assigned to you. You're the reporter and the assignee. Wow. Okay, great. So that one's taken care of. All right. So then if we go into in progress, we have two PRs that are open. One is around limiting view renaming. So I want to call this out, especially since Cijo is on the call. This is a basically we are concerned around the current spec being a little too flexible, and we wanted to limit one area where we know things fall apart. So if you specify a view name and you have some sort of an instrument selector that you know selects many possible instruments or metric names, it can cause errors because you can only have one view name for one instrument, if that makes sense. You can have multiple views per instrument, but you can only have one of the same name. And so if you use a name rule, you can get into a problem where you basically suppress a bajillion metrics by accident. So we wanted to actually outlaw that in the spec. That's what this PR is about. There was a bunch of feedback from Cijo that was great. So I tried to respond to it. But effectively, the wording of this limitation is now limited to only where people pre-register selection criteria. So please take a look. I'd like to try to get that through this because this is a spec change. It makes a must requirement that we could alleviate later if we need. But right now, if we don't get this through, basically we have it open in the spec, so everyone needs to allow it, as opposed to if we disable it, we can fix it later. Okay. The other thing in here outside of limiting views was exemplar clarifications. There's some good discussion on that as well. There should be no semantic changes to exemplars here, but there were a whole bunch of various concerns and bugs that I tried to address in the same PR. So I'll just call out two. One was, when do you reset exemplar state? And so I just want to comment that the intention in the spec is that exemplars should be sampled from the time period that the metric data point is reported against. So there's an exemplar reservoir that's specified with a, sample, a measurement, and a collect method, right? The state of that thing needs to be reset based on the cumulative or delta time window that you're using for your exemplars, because your exemplars should be against the entire cumulative window or against the entire delta window. That's kind of the idea behind exemplars. I don't think I did a great job in the spec, and I think y'all called it out. Please take a look at this clarification and make suggestions for how to make that easier to read and easier to understand. That's part one. Part two was, there's a question around the motivation behind exemplars and what they do, why they're different than traces, and what kind of correlations they enable that aren't otherwise possible. So that is also added in there. And yeah, thanks to everyone who reviewed that so far. But we could use some more eyes. The last is a bug that I don't think anyone has submitted a PR for, and I think is somewhat worth discussing here. And this is around removing baggage interactions from the view API and metrics. Okay, so the discussion on the bug was just to mark this aspect of the spec unstable, which is okay, but I also think we should discuss. So the issue was raised by Anurag, and here's the TLDR. We are building instrumentation libraries for our instrumentation. An instrumentation library is a higher level library that is meant to give both traces and metrics. That library should be able to decide the interaction of baggage, and they're trying to extract attributes once for both traces and metrics. In the current tracing spec, there is no direct, like, implicit interaction between generating a trace and baggage. That is always manual by the user. In the metric spec, we added in views the ability to automatically pull baggage attributes out in a view and declare that as part of the configuration. And we prototyped that and got it working. So a metric view can say, here are baggage attributes that if you find, you should pull and attach it to the metric. The interaction with tracing is completely unknown. And the interaction with this instrumentation library design that currently exists in Java is very poor, in the sense of the instrumentation library will pull out baggage attributes. The view library will also pull out baggage attributes. You get a conflict that's just implicitly ignored. And so it kind of works, but it's really weird, right? So the question here is, what do we want to do about baggage? And I want to expand to say, what should we do for the release of the metrics SDK initially? Do we want to include any kind of baggage interaction?
So I want to step in as I'm trying to kind of follow up behind Josh in implementing the Go side of this. And that was one of the things that I quickly pointed out is, if we have this ability for the views to take information from the context of the synchronous thing, which is where the baggage ends up living, then we also have to, we first off have to propagate that context all the way through to the views and beyond, like how it's originally aggregated all the way into the views. But then also it has this weird interaction of, why is this an option that we have in the metrics portion when this is realistically something that needs to be in an instrumentation library? Like your HTTP instrumentation library can give you an option to pull that baggage out, where it actually has context about where that baggage is coming from and how that might be handled. So my recommendation is, honestly, we shouldn't be pulling it out at in the higher order library. It should be at the one step below. Like if your HTTP library is instrumented with OTel code, they should be manipulating the context and the baggage there.
I see. Your definition of higher order and mine are inverted. So to me, the metrics SDK is the lowest possible library that you can leverage, right? And then the tracing would be like the lowest possible tracing library, and an instrumentation library is built above it. So the idea here is we make baggage interactions explicit, and then the higher level library can deal with it. So we just remove, like, what I don't want to do is have baggage be experimental in the SDK that we launch, because it means that all of our APIs around views have to be able to handle that in the future, or release in a stable way that can handle it. Where if we don't plan to do it, that's kind of a big tax, right? I know that the baggage thing is working in Java. I don't know if .NET implemented that bit or not, but the lack of baggage interaction in trace, I don't think was a, we don't want to have interaction in the trace API. It was, we don't know what to do yet, right?
I understand that, but it's put us in a position where if you are a library, an instrumentation library, you are forced to handle it. And I think that's the right level of abstraction of where the baggage lives. I think at some point, the baggage interaction at the instrumentation library, at the like OTel HTTP library, has enough context from the request to pull, can have enough context from the request to pull out the user specific options and put them into metadata that we propagate normally through traces, right? And I think the same thing can exist within metrics. We don't necessarily need to have that at the next layer, either up or down, however you want to describe it.
Yeah, I guess my argument here would be then that I think we need to specify what that configuration looks like around leveraging baggage. So one of the ideas behind views, so for those of you familiar with Prometheus, because it's the biggest metric system, Prometheus has this thing called rewrite rules that are used heavily. And that is, how do I control what metrics are ingested, right? And it's the most significant, important thing you need to add beyond just having a client library. For push-based metrics, it's the opposite. Recording rules, sorry. Rewrite rules, recording rules. I was calling them rewrite rules because they rewrite, whatever. Recording rules. So push-based metrics, our solution to that is views, right? Because we're the source of the truth, and the way we limit what goes over the network is actually like right in what we push. And in the collector, then there's like filters and things that we can do. But views are the first line defense around not generating too much telemetry and not sending too many network things that we can handle. In Prometheus, you know, there's those like header things where you can say like limit the number of metrics and all that stuff when you make a call. That's your config. That's their version of views. This is, so we need configuration to be able to handle this. And my concern right now is how consistent will baggage be with selecting like what spans I emit, what metrics I emit, what attributes those metrics have. Like I want to, so it sounds like we should probably just remove completely from the spec any talk to baggage, but I do want to make sure that we figure this out and that it's consistent. I think the configuration for what's exported in traces, what's exported in metrics, in addition to how to pull in baggage, needs to be consistent across all of these things. That was the idea behind having it in views to begin with, I think. So that's the important bit I want to call out. Okay.
So would it be fair, like there is already, well, there sort of is already a baggage API, right? And would it be fair to say that it's not necessarily consistent across the instrumentation libraries, so the ones that I talk about, but would it be better to put a recommendation for instrumentation libraries on this is how you'd handle it? Because that's where I believe this abstraction needs to lie. Like that's my opinion, at least. And then that's kind of covering our basis of like, when you receive a request, you pull out this baggage, and you, if you are tracing, you attach it to traces. If you are creating metrics, you attach it to your metrics, and that's how you manipulate that. Assuming that you have synchronous metrics, right?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I actually kind of want to get these instrumentation libraries specified. I think it'd be important for folks doing that instrumentation to get a group together, because if we're pushing these details in higher level APIs, I still think it matters. Like, again, consistency for users. How do I control what telemetry is ingested consistently across everything, right? And how much of it belongs in the collector? How much of it belongs in these libraries? Good question. When it comes to attributes, there's significant reasons you need to control it on the client level, right? We have some cardinality limits in Java that we're just tweaking around with to make sure that we don't explode memory usage, right? These are deciding to choose baggage in metrics may be different than in traces. And
It
so
may be,
if
but
we remove the metrics only version of it, there's implications I just want to make sure we've thought about. But I think, so TLDR, let's remove it from the spec. Let's have this discussion, but not now. Okay, cool.
that's
so
only one
last
opinion,
thing,
though.
Well, no, I think that was the consensus before, was to mark it unstable. What I'm proposing is let's just remove it from the spec instead of marking it unstable, so we don't have this weird restriction. Anyone have time to go make that PR and want to drive that through? Aaron, if you feel strongly, would you mind doing that?
I can. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the whole of this, because there's another proposal I also want to get out on the table before we try and solidify this around views specifically. I can talk with you offline, since you've been driving the views, it looks like.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. Regarding context, by the way, don't forget that you need it for exemplars. So getting rid of baggage doesn't solve that and go.
There may be a way.
Hopefully, yeah. Okay, cool. Last thing for metrics then is that was remove baggage and views, which I wanted to make sure, I wanted to be more aggressive on that one. So thank you for having that chat. Last thing, there's a proposal to mark the metrics SDK as stable instead of feature freeze, which it is right now. If you look at every single PR we've discussed, it is add clarity or remove feature. Given we're still removing features, I don't think we want to mark anything stable until at least the end of this month, and so likely in January. And if anybody has huge reservations about that or whatever, let me know. What I want to avoid though is there are folks releasing stable APIs against metrics with unstable SDKs. If we are running into issues with that, because our API is marked stable, by the way, if we're running into issues with that in SIGs and you're unable to continue to make progress with metrics, we should have some discussions. But hopefully this doesn't change anything around the metric timeline that wasn't already there. And we are still not we're not allowing features to be added to the SDK in the spec, which does mean exponential histograms are ground to a halt outside of prototypes, just as an FYI. So we really want to get this SDK marked stable so we can continue that exponential histogram work. That's all I had. If anyone has any other topics.
I guess this is it. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Josh, for driving this. Stay safe and see you around.
See ya.